We are back with Roy Macintyre, this time to share what it was like to be on frontline RAF squadrons. So, Roy, can you talk us through this and maybe give us a bit of a day in the life of a fighter pilot on an F squadron?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me back on to Aircrew Interview. Squadron life for a pilot wasn't 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. It was every day could be different. Having said that, if we weren't on exercise, we weren't on QRA, we tended to work Monday to Friday, not necessarily 9 till 5, however. Typical day. They're all slightly different, but let's assume that I am going to be on the flying program and flying once and doing what somewhere in the formation. Most people would think, well, if you're going flying for about an hour and a half, what do you do for the rest of the day, etc.? Well, for those that don't know, I'll go through it. The start of the day is dictated by Met Brief. And the timing of the Met Brief will be set by the flying program. And if you're on the first wave, typically at 8 o'clock, 8:30 launch, then you're looking at a Met Brief possibly about 6:30 in the morning, maybe 7 o'clock at the latest, but let's say about 6:30. So that means there are people on the squadron, and the engineers have been working through the night, but the aircrew will be in before that, particularly the lead crew. So if I was leading on the first wave with a 6:30 Met, I would be into the squadron by 6 o'clock at a minimum, depending on the complexity of the sortie. So myself and my crew would have to put the sortie together. And some of the work might have been done the day before in terms of coordinating with the agencies we're going to work with. But typically about half an hour's prep, putting the slides together, because bear in mind, back in my day, not quite the Royal Flying Corps, but it would be OHP slides principally, although latterly we did have a computer-based presentation. But whether it was OHP slides and felt pens or putting it onto a computer, we would have to prepare the sortie brief, which would encompass the domestics and the details and rules of what we're actually going to do. So that was pretty much half an hour before Met Brief. I would expect to see the other crew or crews appearing on the squadron shortly before Met Brief. We would agree a time we might needed extra help if it was a particularly complex sortie or a big sortie. If it was a standard routine in-house training sortie, then they would probably pitch up about 10 minutes, 5 minutes before Met, cup of coffee in their hand, of course. The other person that's around at that point from the aircrew point of view is the auth, the authorising officer, who's basically going to manage for a period of time, probably the morning, depending on how the programme was written. He's going to manage this flying programme on behalf of the boss. Now, he will coordinate with the engineers, allocate aircraft, look at how the weather is developing, and probably give the Met Brief. Could be the lead crew that would give the Met Brief, which comes in form of an information pack. In the old days, OHP slides, latterly on computer from the Met office on the airfield. So he would then sort out, and he could conceivably, depending on how the programme goes, he could be also the duty officer flying, the DOF. Now, what does that mean? That's another job for somebody. It could be me on a particular day. It means that I am responsible for the flying on the station on behalf of OC Ops, and above that, the station commander. What does that mean? Well, I nominate the flying diversions, the flying state, the recovery state, liaise with air traffic over the duty runway, and make decisions if there's problems with some of the equipment, if the ILS is on maintenance or something like that, or the radar is going to go on maintenance. And if it's bad weather, you might end up having to move up to the tower to supervise things going on. We do have somebody else, a more junior officer available, possibly, called the DAO, the Duty Aircrew Officer, who could sit in the tower as a deputy to the DOF, the duty officer flying, who has to sit in the ops desk in the squadron and man running the program as well as running the bigger picture, as it were, in terms of flying. But anyway, there are these players there. It could be me. I might be in the lead aircraft, I might be down the subordinate, or I might be the DOF. In any case, we've been in since about about 6 o'clock for a 6:30 Met brief. And then we have a sortie brief starting with the Met, and then we run through. That'll take about half an hour, maybe a little bit longer, depending on how verbose the briefing officer is, but it should be about half an hour. Great. So after that, we then go to the outbrief. The outbrief is where we stand at the ops desk and the authorising officer, who may be the DOF, but the squadron authorising officer goes through a checklist, and it's basically a catch-all. Have you done this? Have you done that? Have you checked that? Tell me what you're doing, blah, blah. So it's basically the last safety check that we've got all the information we need, we're complying with the rules, and we know any late inputs, etc. He also checks what we've written in the authorization sheets, which is the legal document that permits us to go flying. Having done all that and checked everything off, we then go through, we get our flying kit on, and then we walk out either to the engineer's line hut or to the squadron has where the aircraft are. Depends on the squadron, how they're managing it. But the next thing we're looking for as a crew is we're looking for the 700, the Form 700, which is the maintenance document, which I'll, as captain, will go through and will check the limitations, the servicing state, and basically checking the aircraft's legal and fit to fly. I then sign, which is my legal permission to take possession of the aircraft. So there's two bits of it. There's what happened in the squadron building, the legal authorization to go and do what we're intending to do, and I sign the 700. I can now take that aircraft to go and do what we're going to do. We then strap it, having done the walk round, strap it, all that sort of stuff, get started up. Basically, it's going to take us from leaving the squadron building to getting to the end of the runway to depart, another half hour. So if we've gone 7, that's 7:30. So it's a 7:30 takeoff. We could slip that 30 minutes for an 8 o'clock takeoff, but that's basically it. So from start of brief to getting in was about an hour, possibly, depending on weather. If we're in the winter and it takes us longer to get kitted up in the immersion suits, it might be 3/4 of an hour. So we then get able. So now you can see there's already been a bit before the flying, which is only going to be an hour and a half in my day. There's been quite a bit beforehand. So we go up, we go to do the sortie, we fly, and then we recover back to base an hour and a half later. And it's again, not just dump the aircraft, go into the coffee bar and drink coffee. There's quite a bit. It's going to take us about 15 minutes or so from landing to taxiing in, to shut down, to debriefing the engineers, to go back to the line hut, because that's where the 700 will be now, sign the aircraft back in, talk to the engineers specialists if there's any snags, so they can understand what the problem is and have a good idea of fixing it. Then we go back into the squadron building, sign back in at the auth desk, having got out of our flying kit, to basically tell the story about what we did in terms of the legality, and then probably a 10-minute break while we go into the coffee bar and grab coffee, and then we've got to debrief. We would be wasting the taxpayers' money if we didn't fully debrief to get all the learning points out, which is what it's all about. We're all learning to progress and increase our skills. The debrief might be a little bit more complicated by the fact we were working with an outside agency, perhaps another squadron. So we would have to contact them. Now, I have mentioned in previous interviews before about the raids pods and that makes it a whole lot easier. And of course, computer debriefing makes things a lot slicker. But typically, and this is where the variable feast is, and it'll vary with individuals and how the squadron went, but how the sortie went. But a debrief could be half an hour. It could be an hour, depending on what's going on and how much reference we have to make to the recordings coming from the aircraft. But to be honest, and we are, certainly as an instructor, we're taught that, and it's a debrief that's going on much longer than an hour. You know, you see everybody else sort of going, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And you're wasting your time. because the points you're trying to make are not going in. So it's important you get to the salient points and keep them relevant, and not let the debrief extend much more than an hour if you can help it. So we've gone back, and so we're now well into the morning and getting towards lunchtime. And you see, that's pretty much the morning taken up for somebody flying. As I say, I could be on the desk, in which case I've been supervising the departure and recovery of other sorties that have gone on in the morning wave. Other things that might be happening would be simulators and things like that. So if I'm not involved in the morning wave flying, I could well be programmed to go to the simulator, which is an hour's slot. So again, 10 minutes across, if I was stay on, I'm going to say it, on treble one on the south side, 10 minutes to drive round to the simulator building at Lookers, as was, an hour sortie there, and then 10 minutes back. So you can see that's an hour 20 just for what it appears to be a quick 1 hour slot on your day. So there is that. Food is available generally on most of the sites. They have what they call a feeder, because of course there's engineers, or a big team of engineers there who can't necessarily get away to the mess. So it's basically a cafeteria type affair. And the one thing about the flying program, though, is they don't program in lunch hour for the aircrew. And it could well be that you're flying over lunchtime, particularly if you've got air-to-air refueling or something like that. Mm-hmm. We just learned that was life. There was usually stuff behind the coffee bar that you could make sandwiches and stuff like that if you missed the feeders. The feeder was open for a reasonable length of time over the lunchtime period, but it wasn't unknown for you to go, by the time you get back, finish your debrief, feeder's shut. All right, well, I'll try and scrape a sandwich together then, but that's life, One of those things that if you couldn't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined, sort of style. And it wasn't too uncommon, you were programmed to fly again in the afternoon, you generally wouldn't be leading both sorties. I might have been leading the first sortie, but then a subordinate in the second. You might have an hour, half an hour, and then going straight into another sortie brief, in which case, by the time you're finished, you're looking at 5 o'clock for the debrief, and that's your day. So 2 sorties a day, that is your complete day. And generally speaking, after that, you were heading off home. Behind all that is what we call personal admin. It was a catch-all phrase, but some of it was quite genuine. There'd be paperwork to come in to do with all sorts of stuff, like a claim that hasn't been paid. You've got to go to the medical centre for something, or there's something to do with a course coming up. Or there was work that's come down from your flight commander. Now, I just talk about how the squadron was, from the aircrew point of view, set up, because, and I talk about the F3, so there's about 30 aircrew. Obviously, there's only half of that, I think, on a Typhoon and an F-35 squadron. I don't know, but there's much less people, much fewer people around. For most of the aircrew, you were split into 2 flights, A and B, imaginatively named, with a flight commander in charge of both. Now, myself as a qualified weapons instructor, I was part of the weapons flight, W flight, with the squadron leader in charge, and there'd be 3, maybe 4 of us in weapons flight, and we would be responsible for the tactics, training and exercises coming up, particularly big detachments and stuff like that. There was also T flight, training flight, which usually had a senior squadron leader QFI and a flight lieutenant QFI who were responsible for the pilot training and currency, and if there was a Stanival visit coming up, etc., etc. So there were those minor flights. Latterly, because they needed to give squadron leaders the chance to have a squadron leader exec tour, they split A and B flight into A, B, and C flight, where there was OCC as well as OCA and OCB. All it did was reduce the numbers. But if we just think back, keep it simple, A and B flight, generally speaking, they put A flight on days 1 week with B flight on nights. and nights for B flight would start about 4 o'clock, maybe. Again, varies with the time of year because you've got to fly at night when it's dark. And of course, in the summer, that was dragging on a bit.
Yeah.
Whereas it's easier in the winter. And then the next week, they would flip over. So A flight would be on nights and B flight would be on days. Us on W flight, we would just float as required, but they wouldn't switch us between day and nights in the week. Because that was kind of difficult to get your rest period in and stuff like that. So generally you would find yourself on days or on nights, but to be attached to whichever flight needed our particular help, etc., etc. So that's how it kind of went on the squadron. So although it sounds Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 or 8 till 5, if you weren't flying and you weren't involved on the desk, what else could you do? Well, there was always go down the gym for a bit of health session, etc., etc. There were usually things going on the station that required your attention, because the other thing behind all of this is a thing called secondary duties. Mm-hmm. And secondary duties were the things, like the jobs that they didn't have enough people to do but needed to be done, both on the squadron and on the station as a whole. And of course, they were used as another asset to your annual report, which was all geared towards you getting promoted if you wanted to go that way. So secondary duties, what could they be? Well, on the squadron, one of the worst ones was coffee bar officer. You were in charge of the coffee bar, so you're responsible for making sure the coffee bar was provisioned, make sure coffee, biscuits, whatever it was you got. So flying-wise, we accrued something called aircrew rations. Now, for helicopters and multi-engine boys, that represented crates and crates of curry and stuff like that. They got on board the aircraft and ate while they're flying. Now, we in the fast jet world couldn't do that. So in lieu, they credited us with some money. So what you could do was take that money, or the credit of the money, and go to the NAFI and buy stuff for the coffee bar. We could also self-finance. So that's how we got it. So there was somebody had to do that. So that's Officer IC Coffee Bar. But there were lots of other jobs, etc., that needed doing on the squadron. And if you didn't do it, the flight commander would be sort of tapping you on the shoulder going, "Oi, what's going on?" Probably the most infamous one for 43 is Officer IC Cox. And we did have a cockerel or two and hen, and they needed looking after. So that usually went to the junior pilot or junior nav, etc. But you'd have things like the affiliation officer. He'd be responsible for contacting other squadrons around the UK, or perhaps in Germany in the old days, and seeing if they had the facility or the capability and their timetable fitted for us to work together and stuff like that. So that took a little bit of load off the individual squadron leads, etc. Out on the station, there were lots of jobs, various clubs that needed an officer IC, because usually it involved money and therefore that responsibility that went with it. For a time, I was officer IC the flying club, strangely enough, and that was quite a rewarding job, but it did take up quite a bit of time, particularly around the time of annual inspections by the air officer who was in charge of the RAF flying clubs. He would come round and visit. So a bit of prep with that. One of the worst ones to get, and I managed to avoid it, was OIC, a barrack block, one of the airmen's barrack blocks. So again, any problems with that, you were the first point of call. You had to be responsible. You occasionally had to go round and do inspections and stuff. So that's just a taster of what else is there. And it's not too difficult to imagine that your days, and not just one day, but the whole week, can be filled up quite quickly. And, with a flying sortie and maybe a simulator as well, flying sortie period on the desk, you'd find the day's gone before you know where you are. And it's 5:30, you're thinking, right, day shift, we're heading home, knowing that maybe you're going to be back in again at 6:30 tomorrow morning for a Met brief, or at least maybe running the desk or something like that. So while on paper, I went flying for an hour and a half today. Yeah, well, what else did you do? You just sit around at the coffee bar drinking coffee? Not as such. And for that reason, it's it was not uncommon to walk into the coffee bar and find nobody there, because even with
Okay.
30 aircrew, people are doing stuff. Because the other bit that's attached here that I haven't touched on yet is QRA, and that applies to the Typhoon squadrons now. QRA takes out, depending on how it's been run, it'll take out the crew that's there on queue, and it also takes out the crew that has just come off QRA, because you get 24 hours stand down having been on duty for 24 hours, which is what QRA is for us. For the ground crew, it was 7 days. If we're holding double queue because the other squadron was away on detachment or whatever, then you've got 2 crews in the shed and 2 crews off the programme having 24 hours stand down. QRA starts at the handover starts at 8:30, or did start at 8:30. Again, you go to the separate accommodation for the QRA facility. Met brief given by the off-going DFC. Now, DFC not Distinguished Flying Cross, but the Duty Force Commander. And he, like the DOF, the duty officer flying on the squadron, is responsible to OC Ops and the station commander for the running of QRA. So he would make the decisions about the recovery states and the diversions for QRA, which could well be, and probably were, different from the station diversions, because by the nature of QRA, you're flying much further. So you could be involving Scandinavian, well, basic Norwegian diversions, or ones much further south. So he would be giving the Met brief and the Q state. The oncoming crew would go out and look at the aircraft, set it up as they would wish for a rapid takeoff, pre-position their equipment. By that I mean their LSJs and helmets. Some would leave it out in the HAZ. Winter would get a bit cold, so I always kept my equipment in the building, but ready to hand. Get all your documents squared away, and when you're happy, there was a formal, right, I have Q, because there would be no mistake, because at any point in the brief, the hooter could go, and there is no reason why we should be in the situation of, well, who's going? If we would know to the second who is holding QRA.
Right.
And to that end, there is this, what seems a very formal, right, are you happy? Yes. Right, we have it. And at that point, the duty of QRA passes to the crew and crews coming on. So the other crew could then tidy up, pack their bags, get in their cars, go home. We then have the day on QRA, which sometimes was very interesting, but for a lot of the times you're sitting in the lazy boy chair, looking at the telly, wondering what we're going to have for lunch. And it would go on. And you go through the night and you go to bed, and you might get called, you might not. If you don't, you still get the next day off, which you would then, approaching 8:30, wait on the crews coming in and go through your handover, etc. So that's QRA, which also takes you out effectively, as far as the squadron's concerned, for 2 whole days, because you've got your day on queue and then your queue stand down, where you just head on home. They sometimes ask you to do a simulator as soon as you come off queue, and that gets 2 birds with 1 stone. It gets a stat done, it gets your personal stat done, and yet it costs you an hour for your time off. But, most people are quite happy to do that. Where it got a little bit difficult is going, well, would you be happy to fly on the first wave, because we're kind of short of people? And the problem with that is most people don't always get a decent night's sleep on QRA. It's strange bed, all that sort of stuff. Even if you were called out in the middle of the night, that's a non-starter. But if you weren't launched at all, then it's down to the individuals to go, yeah, I feel all right, I will do it. But you're perfectly within your rights to go, no, I'm not, I didn't get a decent night's sleep. Sorry, I'll do a sim and we'll go home. And that was basically how it worked. And of course, the QRA's duties flowed on into the weekend. So you could be coming on a Saturday, you could be coming on a Sunday, etc., etc. That was just life, because it was 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, etc., 365 days a year.
Yeah.
Behind all of that, of course, you had things like courses that you might be away on for personal development or whatever, professional courses. There were detachments coming up, the Falklands behind that, which we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the squadron had exercises and or deployments coming up, which then disrupted the whole thing. And it was pretty much the same for all the squadrons, really. The only squad in my time, if we talk about the F3, at its height, obviously the OCU 229/56 squadron down at Coningsby initially, and latterly when it was up at Lookers, worked off the line, and they had a different routine because they were on shorter training sorties, so their routine tended to be a little bit shorter but busier. You could quite often be flying twice a day and maybe doing a bit of the desk, and you still had to get your at least one sim in a month, etc. But if we look at the frontline squadrons, with the exception of 11 when it first set up at Leeming, which also worked off the line, they were all in HAS sites. Yeah. They were all had squadron hardened accommodation, so that the routine and the mechanics of it were all pretty much the same. So, yeah, you'd walk into the crew room and you'd have different memorabilia, different pictures, paintings on the wall, possibly a different colour scheme depending on the squadron. But you pretty much know where you're going. If somebody said, you need to go through to the hard to see the safety equippers, right? I know where that is because it's the same building in a different location, no matter where you are. The big difference between the squadrons really were the personalities that were on board at the time. Obviously coloured by the bosses, big time, and to a certain extent by the flight commanders. And then, the junior officers, there were much more of them, so they tended to have less of an influence. But initially, I know I've mentioned this before, we tended to be quite insular in terms of on the base. So Leeming, the squadrons met at the bar, but not really professionally, and the same at Lookers. And then when it came to postings, they tended to post you off base rather than across the runway. And I think Coningsby tended to hang on to its people a bit better or more because of the OCU and its constant demand for people and instructors coming through. So 29 and 5 tended to feed the OCU a lot more than people coming down from Leeming and Lookers, because it was easier that people didn't have to move. So to that end, there tended to be, I think, the Coningsby Mafia more than Lookers and Leeming. But latterly, we got into this idea that, look, we're not separate units, we're a wing, and beyond that, we're a force. So there was a lot more cross-runway postings, and my time at Leeming was limited to the late 80s and early 90s, so I don't know how they went into the 90s and the 2000s, but certainly I can speak for Coningsby and Lookers. There was a lot more cross-runway posting, which helped to mix things up in terms of how we operated, because people had a lot more experience from other squadrons, etc. But still, individual characters of the squadron, apart from the colours, black and white checkers, black and gold, wherever you are, it was the boss. And bosses changing definitely changed how squadrons operated in terms of day-to-day management and general feeling about the place. It didn't change the SOPs, didn't change how we went about what we did in the air, but they certainly did colour how you felt on the squadron, and morale was variable, shall I say, depending on, circumstances, what was going on at the time, and who was in the boss's office behind the desk, etc. And that's all I'll say about that. It was up and down.
Yeah. But to kind of briefly talk about that, Roy, so if you were going to go, let's say that, for instance, you're on 43, but you're going to get a posting for 56, but the boss, you'd be like, I'm not really sure about that person. Could you change, or is that's where you're posted to?
You could always put your case for either not moving or
Right.
moving to a particular place to the personnel people down south. But to be honest, your input is a very small percentage of the big picture. And so to that end, no. You're going across the runway to 56, as I did from Treble 1. I'd been on Treble 1 for 7 years. Not through choice, but because of that's how it had to work to move people around. Because the personnel management people are looking at people's careers, and those that are looking like they're going to get promoted, be it from flight lieutenant to squad leader or squad leader up to wing commander, need to do things. There are ground tours they need to do. There are courses they need to do. The squadrons still need people of certain qualifications and qualities, etc. And it so happened that it fitted their requirements that I stay on Treble 1 for 7 years. But they eventually said, "No, we need you across the runway to 56." And I was going into the Stanival office. Yeah, a new challenge. You can get a bit stale, like in any job. You could be, just there a little bit too long. Motivation starts to go. It all becomes a bit routine. Wasn't a domestic disturbance for me. I was literally just going to go to a different building, a different hangar on the station. But to answer your question about the boss, I'm afraid that was irrelevant as far as my desires were concerned. You just had to, right, brace yourself. I'm not going to get on with this guy. Fortunately, both bosses I had on 56 for that particular period towards the end of my time on the squadron were very good friends of mine, and I had no problem there at all. And same with the flight commanders, because by that stage I pretty much knew everybody. But for Flight Lieutenant Joe Smith getting posted to whatever squadron down at wherever, and he knows the squadron boss, he's had a run-in with him before, or they knows him by reputation, and sorry, that's life, and you just have to get on with it.
What you do, you obviously flew the Phantom and the Tornado F3, but just driving home from work, were you just thinking like, oh, I wonder what's for tea tonight? Or do you be like, right, I just went up against some F-15s, a couple hours ago. How did you debrief personally when going home?
Right, it's a good question. A lot of aircrew had different ways of dealing with it. To begin with, I was still replaying things in my mind. And in the early days, before I was married, I'd go back to the mess and you just rabbit on about what you did, etc., etc. Latterly, once I was married, and when the kids came along, my wife told me that she never wanted to know if I had used up one of my 9 lives. She didn't want to know about close shaves, etc., or a near accident, etc. Now and I respected that, but that did put a little bit of pressure, because if I did have, and I have had in the past, a near miss in air combat, you think, wow, or you've had a problem which started to develop into something. Fortunately, I never had anything, a malfunction in the aircraft that came close to ejecting, but plenty of occasions I've had to put it into the cable, either at Lookers or divert to Lossiemouth, whatever that. You do want to replay that in your mind, and there is a little bit of pressure inside. And I didn't have that safety valve for my particular family. Latterly, because I did so many sorties, it became routine, and I almost, how was it today? Yeah, it was fine. We went up flying this morning. Weather was a bit rubbish, blah, 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 etc. Ask her about her day, and that was about it. Talking about driving home, though, I did find to begin with that speed translated from aircraft to car when I was younger. But I found it quite easy just to get in the car and just drive. at legal speeds and find that I just switched off completely.
Right.
And I'm not in a fast jet anymore. And it was quite easy. I'm in a car driving public roads, driving at legal speeds, and no problem at all. So in that respect, it was quite simple to switch off. And then latterly, and I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but when the drink driving laws, particularly in Scotland, really tightened up, and I lived off base like many of the aircrew did, it kind of killed happy hour in the mess a little bit, because you couldn't really drink. I've got an 8-9 mile journey to make to get home. So I stopped going to happy hour, which was a shame. And happy hours really started to die in my time in the Air Force. I can't speak for Lossiemouth or Coningsby now, but certainly the Lookers happy hours were dying. And the drink driving laws had a big part in that. Not that I'm saying they were wrong. That was just life. So how did I deal with it? Well, on Fridays, heading home, the other thing was, and I understand perfectly, that we were not allowed to be seen to be drinking in pubs, in public, in uniform. There was a hangover from security days from Northern Ireland and other problems, but also it's the public image. They didn't want to see RAF personnel getting drunk, maybe making a fool of themselves, whatever, in uniform in public. Not good PR. Get that. So the way I got round it, yes, you could say I was getting round it, is I was a social member of the local rugby club in Cooper. Now, the rugby club is a private club. It's also a quarter of a mile from my house. So generally on a Friday, I would drive into Cooper, put the car into the car park at the rugby club. They were perfectly happy and pleased to see me walk in my flying suit, and I could have 2 or 3 jars in the rugby club and then walk home and then come round and get my car on Saturday morning. Yeah. So latterly, socially, my happy hour was the Howe of Fife Rugby Club in Cooper. And I deemed that to be legal because it's a private club, not open to the general public. Whether the station commander would have seen it that way is neither here nor there. So anyway, that's how things developed when you were coming off the base and going home. It either became quite quickly quite routine, or I managed to be able to get my own happy hour somewhere else.
Kind of on that kind of point, though, but if you were popping home and your wife or girlfriend at the time said, Roy, we need a loaf of bread, and you're still in your flying suit, could you pop into Tesco and get it, or would you be like, I can't do that?
It was generally frowned upon, but not a no, you are not to, because into the shops, etc., not a problem. And actually, towards the end, they wanted to have their cake and eat it, in as much as, no, you're not going into a pub and being seen drinking, but they started to encourage you to be seen in uniform. When the security level and the threat disappeared, they were quite keen for you to be seen about the town, because you were, as long as you were respectable, you were advertising the Air Force, as it were. So towards the end, circumstances permitting, nipping into Tesco's to do stuff was actually perfectly all right. And certainly at the petrol station, fill the car up and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it was a kind of a double-edged sword there, depending on what it meant to the Ministry of Defence.
Well, Roy, thank you very much for coming on the show again to share, your stories on their frontline squadron. It's been fascinating to, chat to you as always. But always appreciate it, mate.
No bother at all. Pleased to be there, and I'll see you again.
Cheers.